This is just the beginning.
Good afternoon. I'm Erica Pandy, a business reporter at Axios, and I want to welcome our audiences joining us today live from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, Axios.com, and beyond to our event on the future of broadband connectivity in the coronavirus crisis and beyond. I want to thank Comcast for making our conversations possible today and partnering with us. And with that, I'll welcome my first guest, Plinio Ayala, who is the CEO and president of Scholas.
Thank you, Erica. Nice to be here with you.
Welcome, Plinio, and thanks for joining us from New York. So I want to start first with just having you tell us a little bit about what Scholas is and what got you into this work of digital equity.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in the poorest congressional district in the country, the South Bronx, during a time in the borough's history where entire pockets of our community picked up and left. There were abandoned buildings everywhere, poverty was pervasive, and yet there was a sense of hope amongst me and many of my friends that somehow we'd figure out a way for a better life. Sadly, opportunity only came to a handful of us, and many of my friends, unfortunately, either ended up dying way too early or ending up in jail. And it wasn't because they lacked talent or motivation. It was because there were limited opportunities in my community. And as I grew older, I realized that if there was going to be change in communities that are most vulnerable, that we needed to provide opportunities to skills development for individuals to not only obtain a job, but to be able to obtain a good paying career. And that really changes families' trajectories. It really creates thriving communities. And for me, IT represents a real unique opportunity, right? It allows individuals that may not have degrees to be able to succeed and access these middle-class jobs that allow them to have good lives and extend those lives to their family members and their community members as well.
So when we were catching up before, today, we were talking about how the pandemic has made all of these things, what you experienced growing up, way worse, exacerbated it all. How has the pandemic, in your eyes, made digital equity more important than ever?
It's clear that this pandemic has led to tens of millions of Americans losing their jobs, with Black and Hispanic communities being disproportionately impacted, right? Unfortunately, the equity the inequity that exists in our communities is even further magnified by this digital divide where roughly 1 in 5 Americans have no access to broadband or laptops. And in communities of color, it's even worse, where about 33% of households don't have access to internet or a computer. And we've all heard the stories of so many of our students at various levels of our educational system struggling to keep up, not because they are incapable, but because they don't have the appropriate technology and internet access that they need to be successful. And unfortunately, that speaks volumes to the impact that the digital divide continues to have in communities that are less affluent. And by the way, this isn't a new problem, right? It existed way before this pandemic. But in order for this country, I think, to realize an equitable recovery for all Americans, this issue is going to need to be addressed in the very, very near future. And I think that's why the work that we do at Scholas is even more important now than ever before.
Right. I mean, that's a great point you bring up. The work you're in is educating people, getting them, up to par on digital skills and helping them get those new jobs. How do you do that work when people don't even have devices or broadband at home? You can get the skills, but if you don't have the infrastructure, it's really tough.
That is very, very true. And Eric, at the beginning of this pandemic, and even though we have begun investing in virtual training last year, we quickly had to pivot all of our in-classroom operations to a virtual model. 520 learners converted from in-classroom to online. And in the middle of the transition, we heard from many of our learners that they didn't have the right equipment to be able to complete the course. And so we quickly pivoted, deploying hundreds of pieces of equipment, from laptops to headsets to Wi-Fi modules, to ensure that our learners had the necessary tools to succeed. And at the same time, at the request of our employer partners, we revamped large portions of our curriculum to help prepare our learners for this new world of remote work. And all of these pivots were incredibly important because at Scholas, we realized that we've got two sets of constituents that are incredibly important to our work. It's certainly the learners that receive the training, but it's also our employer partners, employers who are involved in the development of our programs, in the design of our curriculum. They rely on this amazing, diverse talent that we produce to access new workers that they can employ. And so for us, this pivot into this world of digital has caused us to revamp our model. We're going to have to deploy equipment going forward to ensure that our learners are obtaining the skills that our employers are requiring. It is simply the right thing to do.
And I want to talk about this idea of pivot. I mean, one of the big topics I cover are jobs and unemployment. And you've got so many Americans who work, especially in the services sector, for example, bartenders who've been out of work for months now and are thinking, my job, which seemed like a great way to provide for my family, is now seeming very unstable because of the pandemic and how the service sector has been hit. And something like IT would be a much better, much more stable way to move forward. But it is very discouraging for an adult to kind of start all over in a new field where you're suddenly a newbie again. And people do get discouraged and they feel like they might not be able to pull it off. You're in the trenches on this. Is it possible for people to do a career switch from the restaurant industry or hospitality into these tech jobs?
Absolutely. A lot of the skills that workers obtain in the hospitality sector or in the retail sector, customer service skills, are incredibly transferable into the IT space. If you're given the opportunity and you're taught how to do the IT work, the transition is not that difficult. Look, AI was going to cause a disruption in our workforce regardless, right? It was going to eliminate or recreate jobs in hospitality and retail and transportation. The pandemic just accelerated that. And so we need to tell that story to folks that have been displaced, to let them know that they can actually make that transition with the support that we provide and the training we provide. And that will lead them to amazing IT careers.
And, you are obviously working outside of the government. How can the government help organizations like yours to continue to do this work and, help people switch careers, help people get upskilled? Because obviously the government has a big stake in this as well.
They absolutely do. And, I've never been at a time in our country's history where so many effective workforce strategies exist, proven models, evidence-based programs like Scholas. And we need heavier investments, both from public and private sectors, to ensure that these organizations can scale. Look, Erica, if you were going to invest in, let's say, energy stocks, you'd do the research, identify 2 or 3 corporations that you thought could return the most for your dollars, and you'd invest in them. That approach should be very similar in the workforce development space. In a study that we were part of that was released last year, the evaluator indicated that for every dollar invested in Scholas, there's an $8 return to our economy. And that return is significant. And many of our private investors have recognized the impact that we're having. And in many cases, they've either increased their investment or have decided to join the growing list of partners that are investing in our organizations. Most recently, our newest champion partner, Comcast NBC Universal, has provided a very large investment in our work to ensure that we can scale our model to train an additional 1,000 learners in communities across this country. But they can't do it alone. Government needs to be involved. This country needs to implement concrete policy changes that allow more resources to flow in effective models like ours so that we can help more people move into successful IT careers.
So, that's a remarkable stat. $1 invested, $8 return on the economy. And then, I want to take that hyper local for a second. You're in New York. Scholas obviously has a presence in lots of cities, but you're a New Yorker, born and bred. What are you seeing in New York right now? Are you seeing applications go up? Are you seeing people wanting to do this kind of career switching coming to you and saying, what can I do for my future?
We have seen a huge increase across the board of new applicants, but in New York in particular, an increase of over 200% from this point last year. The Americans across the country are desperate for new skills. They want to reinvent themselves. They want to be able to participate in our economy. They want to be able to obtain good paying careers. And I think our responsibility is to figure out ways to scale our model so that we can serve more people. You know, despite the fact that we had to go remotely, our return our success has not diminished, right? We're still graduating folks at over 85%. We're placing folks at 80%. You know, the average wage of our student is 400% more than it was prior to our training program. The impact we're having is quite significant. I am just figuring out ways to try and do more for more people across this country.
And we just have about 30 seconds left, but Plinio, it's been tough times for everybody this year. And I want to end on one thing that you've seen this year through your work that gives you hope for a brighter future next year.
Resilience in our students. You know, under some of the most difficult circumstances, they complete our program. They persist while they're trying to educate their children or care for a sick loved one, because they know at the end of this experience, there's a very, very high likelihood of them building an amazing IT career. You know, I'll quickly share the story of Sasha Jackson, who was a graduate of our Newark program. In the middle of this pandemic, we deployed equipment to her. She persisted, she completed, and now she's working for a company called Capgemini as an IT project manager. She clearly says that without having met per Scholas, her ability to get there probably would not have been realized. And so watching them continue to come, work hard, exhibit their persistence and their grit keeps me going, keeps this organization going every single day.
Thank you so much, Plinio, for joining me this afternoon.
Erica, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Axios CEO Jim Vandehei, for a view from the top segment with President and CEO of the NCTA, Michael Powell.
Thank you very much, Erica. It is now my pleasure to bring you a conversation with Michael Powell, who is the President and CEO of the Internet and Television Association. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Jim.
It might be self-evident to most, but explain what the association does and what you spend most of your time thinking about and doing.
Well, NCTA is the trade association for the traditional cable industry, which includes both cable operators and cable programmers. So companies like Charter, Comcast, and Cox that provide internet service to Americans, as well as major media companies like Disney, Viacom, and Fox. So we work on the issues related to them. And I think currently the issues most prominent are those that are related to the pandemic.
And talk about that. Obviously, every company, every industry's had to adapt to the reality of COVID. Like, how has your industry adapted, and what do you think it's gotten right, and what does it still need to do better?
Well, I think it's important to note that this was the greatest experiment in stressing the internet that we've had in the history of the internet. I mean, we saw surges in traffic as high as 30%, high as 40 or 50% on upstream traffic. So we really had a test of the network capacity, and I think we're very proud of how they performed, which is really a culmination of years of investment, years of excellence in engineering, and frankly, a cultural commitment to the needs of our country at a time where the public health response is heavily dependent on the ability to let consumers stay at home, to work in school. The lifeline for that is the internet connection. So we've been really, really heavily focused on making sure that the network holds up, is doing well, and so far we're really pleased with its performance.
It's like electricity, right? You can almost take it for granted, but then you end up in the COVID era, and all of us, either your job, your school, like so much of it, dependent on that infrastructure. How many years away are we from where everybody, regardless of where you live in the country, even if you're in a rural area, are you going to have the type of stability and connectivity that we have at the sort of the best of places, the big cities where you might have better infrastructure?
I think the first thing we have to say is that it should be a national imperative. It's always been an American policy to have universal broadband, get services to all consumers. Getting infrastructure to rural America is important, but very, very challenging. It's extraordinarily expensive the deeper you get and the fewer customers you have to provide revenue. So it really becomes a kind of serious problem in that regard. You know, we still are waiting to get electricity to 100% of Americans or indoor plumbing to 100% of Americans. You know, that said, technology has the advantage of many different flavors of technology that lower in cost over time. And I think with the right government support programs and a commitment and partnership with industry, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, we could dramatically reduce the number of Americans who've yet to see an internet connection. And then the second half of that problem is just the growing challenges of inequality in our society. How do we get all of our citizens, those who may struggle economically, onto the network or have other reasons that prevent them from adopting a service that's otherwise available to them? In that regard, we're really partnering with school systems, for example, to make sure we serve students who are working from home, who don't otherwise have a broadband infrastructure. It's a program we're very, very proud of called K-12 Bridge to Broadband, where we're working with school systems to provide low-income access to those programs. And those are the kinds of things we need to be doing as a society.
I don't think it's hyperbole to say that in some ways, for a lot of students, that the internet infrastructure is as important as electricity, right? If you don't have the right type of connectivity, the conversation you and I are having, a student can have with their teacher. Where have you gotten it right, and where is it still insufficient in terms of allowing students who might be stuck at home for another year to be able to have the type of connectivity they need to be able to continue to get at least a decent education? I think we all agree it's probably inferior not being in close proximity, real proximity to people. Like, how should we think about that?
Yeah, I think the good news is, and the thing I think we sort of have gotten right, is to understand what we do well and what educators do well. This had to be a partnership, working with school systems, school superintendents. One problem they had was identifying which of their students were in need of access. That's not an obvious number, one that we were able to substantially help with by sharing their lists of students against and cross-checking against our databases to identify people who still didn't have access that went to those school systems. So in that regard, the partnership has been very positive, the best of education with the best of infrastructure. Where I think we still struggle, and I'll just make this struggle for society, is while an internet connection is the table stakes, it is by no means sufficient. And what I think we see with our students struggling under the school at home really also goes to, we haven't done enough to educate teachers to teach in this way. We haven't done enough to come up with a curriculum that's well adapted to that kind of remote learning. We haven't done enough to teach students digital skills necessary to be effective. So we can plug people in, but if they're staring at a screen without a lot more knowledge, or they're using inferior devices to access that, or they're with a teacher who's struggling to understand how best to teach in that environment, you're still going to get suboptimal results. We should never pretend schooling at home is the same thing as being in the classroom. We should be grateful we have the internet to make it possible, but sometimes I think we underinvest in all the rest that's essential for getting an optimum experience for a student.
And in like the news I can use category, if I'm living in an area where I don't have great connectivity, maybe I have to go to the library to even tune in and watch the conversation you and I are having. Are there programs to help either low-income people or help people who are living in areas where connectivity is more difficult? Like, what can I do if I'm that person?
So I talk about two things really quickly. One, the cable industry for over a decade has had really effective low-income access programs with prices as low as $9.95 a month for pretty adequate broadband experience. If you've never heard of those, you should reach out onto the websites or look up that information, because that's very widely available. We've put on in excess of 10 million Americans on those programs, and we remain committed to them. Secondly, if you have a child, you should reach out to the school system about the K-12 Bridge to Broadband program. Can your child get access to internet connection through those programs? I think would be really important and constructive. And then finally, companies like Comcast are doing lift zones where they're converting important community centers into broadband centers where they have high-grade Wi-Fi access, so you don't have to be going to the Taco Bell or McDonald's parking lot, and you're in a safe environment that's really been rigged with the best-in-class internet infrastructure. There may be one of those in your community, given that Comcast is committing to standing up close to 1,000 of those centers. So all those companies are doing something like that, and it's worth researching and finding out how you can get access to those programs.
Michael, it's a great way and great tips for people who might be struggling to have the connectivity they need for school or for work. Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating conversation, for making this broader discussion possible. And over to you, Ashley.
Thank you to Jim. Our next guest is the president and CEO of DreamBox, Jessie Woolley-Wilson, joining us from Bellevue, Washington. Hi, Jessie.
Hi, Ashley. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure.
So as you know, we're here to talk about the role of broadband in the COVID-19 pandemic and education. Obviously, we could not live without broadband during this extremely difficult time. So if you could just begin the conversation by speaking broadly about the role of educational technology during the pandemic and how important it is to have equal access to broadband, that would be a great way to get us started.
Sure. I think the easiest way to think about this is to see EdTech as a way to keep learning on when schools and districts have to close. And that's what happened. When school closures were driven by the pandemic, sent millions of kids at home in March. EdTech was a lifeline for teachers and kids, but also for parents. And those were the lucky ones. So we all know that not all kids have access to the learning pods or to technology that's coming up. And so even though it's been a lifeline for a segment of the population, we really have, understood that there are other segments of the population that haven't been able to partake.
And how can companies like yours play a role in help bridging that gap?
So it's really important for EdTech to be seen as a part of a solution. So what we saw at DreamBox was that even when teachers who had used DreamBox in a classroom as part of a blended strategy to complement live instruction were surprised by the school closures, even those that had had some training and readiness weren't ready for full 100% online learning. And so one of the things that we needed to do was to support not only the school-based learning guardian, but also to support the home-based learning guardian, because parents found themselves in the role of the primary learning guardian at home while they juggled their work and other responsibilities. Again, if they were the lucky ones. So EdTech companies needed to stretch. We opened up our platform for free for all of our customers, and we had over 2 million more kids have access to personalized math instruction that they wouldn't otherwise have received. So that was one thing we did. We were a community partner. The second thing that we did was we helped parents with resources. We published additional resources for parents who were not ready and who were not used to online learning and blended learning. And then the third thing that we're doing and we're spending more time on is examining this changing role between the school-based learning guardian or the teacher and the home-based learning guardian, parent and sometimes older sibling. And they have a new partnership as a result of COVID.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel the federal government has done so far in ensuring everybody has access to high-speed broadband, whether you are in a low-income family or you live in a rural area, specifically during the pandemic? And what would you like to see that you haven't seen yet?
So we're all learning. We're all trying to build the plane as we fly it. And what we anticipated was that students who didn't have what I call persistent and consistent access to broadband and devices are falling behind. And it's happening more dramatically in mathematics than it is in reading. And so what's really important is for new approaches to learning that were likely to take hold over the next 5 or 10 years, but have been accelerated by this COVID pandemic. So we need to get prepared for them at the policy level, at the state level, at the local level. And so I would say that there are like 15 million students who didn't have consistent and persistent access, and they're falling behind. And so ironically, companies like DreamBox are part of a system that might be expanding the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And we have to work in partnership with industry and with government entities at the federal, state, and local level to make sure that we do everything we can to mitigate that risk. And there's a couple of things that we know we can do. So imagine if we knew that there were homes that didn't have electricity or heat. We would figure out policy solutions to that. And I think we have to start thinking about access to broadband almost like it was a utility. Are there homes that don't have access to it? And if they don't, why don't they? So there are two buckets. There are homes that can't afford it, even though it's nearby and accessible, and we can have financial supports for them. Then there's a harder bucket. And there are kids and families who don't live close to towers. So even if you gave them access, financial support, they still couldn't access broadband. And so we need to have systematic, high-level federal, state, and local policies to make sure that we bring broadband access. We build towers, literally, where there are no towers, or we provide a strategic approach to providing hotspots so that students can use them. We've seen some creative solutions. We've seen schools that have opened up hotspots and Wi-Fi, and we have parents who drive their cars to the school parking lot so that they can access broadband on an iPad in the car. I mean, so these are scrappy and creative solutions, but these are not scalable and permanent solutions. And we need scalable and permanent solutions. So the next time we have an earthquake or some other disruption that closes schools and districts for an extended period of time, we are ready for it. We have a plan, we have capabilities, and we are ready for it.
Do you think that we've been in the pandemic for so long now, we've certainly had to deal with a lot on the education front. There's a new administration coming in. The FCC is certainly going to be prioritizing this. What is your message to a new FCC with the new chairman about how they should be prioritizing this and what their first priority should be when it comes to increasing access to broadband?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, our federal government should prioritize making broadband access ubiquitous for all. But imagine a household where there are two working parents, they each have their computer, they have broadband, and they have 3 or 4 kids. That home, I would argue, is not equipped to make sure that those 4 kids have what they need for full onslaught online learning or at-home learning. So we have to make it ubiquitous for all, but we also have to make sure it's at the right level. The second thing is, I think that we need to make sure that, as I said, that we see this as a utility. There has to be, and maybe it starts off as a private-public partnership with telecom companies, that's possible, but we need to have a systemic and sustained funding source for to make sure that everybody has broadband access and devices in schools.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some lessons you learned about the role of EdTech during the pandemic and some trends that you think will remain even after kids are back in school and we have some sort of semblance of things being normal again.
So I'm an optimist about what can happen in online learning. And I think that there were many schools and districts that saw it as a nice to have, and they were evolving toward a new practice. And this pandemic has turned a nice to have practice into a must have capability. And so I think we're seeing an acceleration of a move toward blended or home-based learning. The second thing I would say is that we think that there are some permanent changes around school modeling. So what technology can do is it can help deliver personalized, competency-based learning. So it almost doesn't matter if you're in one grade or another. It's a question of whether or not you have demonstrative competency in whatever it is that you're learning, regardless of what your grade is. And I think we are at a precipice where we will probably change from a time and seat-based model of learning to a personalized and competency-based learning model. that can be dramatically supported by personalized learning tools like DreamBox Learning. The third thing I would say is that teacher readiness is probably going to need to be re-envisioned. I like to think of teachers as learning engineers. And if we thought about teachers as learning engineers, we would immediately think that their relationship with data and technology would be different and be expected. And we would train them and prepare them for the environments that they're likely to find in a typical school. And so I see a transformation of the teacher into learning engineer. And I see the readiness of that both in pre-teacher programs, teacher preparation programs at colleges and universities, to job-embedded teacher professional development, so we can help them understand how to use data, how to collect data, and how to modify their instructional strategy in light of that data. And increasingly, that data is going to be dynamic and real-time, like it is at DreamBox Learning. Mm-hmm. The last thing I will say is that I think that this notion of a checkbox, does a student have a device, or a checkbox, does a student have broadband, is going to become more nuanced. And we're going to understand, do they have the right device, and do they have adequate access to broadband? That's in the future.
Mm-hmm. And quickly, what was it like to suddenly have to shift DreamBox from something used as a supplement in classrooms to something playing a bigger role due to the pandemic?
Well, in 8 weeks, we saw over 2 million kids come on the platform. And while that's great, when you grow that fast, you get stretch marks. And our stretch marks were, we had to help parents as well as teachers. We had to help older siblings and aunties and grandmoms. And we weren't really prepared for that. But that's what it took. We actually changed our model too, our product development, so that we could help school districts predict with DreamBox Predictive Insights where kids were over the past 5 months and what they had to do to change to meet them where they are.
Wow. Thank you so much to Jessie Woolley-Wilson for joining Axios. And now I'm throwing it to my colleague, Dan Primack, for our final segment.
Thank you very much, Ashley. My name is Dan Primack. I'm business editor at Axios. And our next guest is Federal Communications Commissioner Geoffrey Starks, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Geoffrey.
Great to join you. Great to be here.
Geoffrey, let's start here trying to maybe quantify this digital divide problem a bit if we can. I know the FCC from time to time has not felt its own data, or the data it's getting is terribly good on this, has kind of tried to reconfigure a little bit. How do you currently view the digital divide issue, and do you think you have good enough data right now to truly understand it?
Yes, the data is certainly a frustrating part of the issue. We don't exactly know who and where folks have broadband and who doesn't. And so a fundamental issue on how we're going to solve and crack down on the digital divide is making sure that we know who has and who has not. But more holistically, we do know a couple of facts here that I think will help anchor the conversation here. First, more than 77 million people in the U.S. lack an adequate home fixed broadband connection. Second, while both are extremely important just in sheer numbers, densely populated areas, urban centers, have nearly 3 times as many unconnected people as do rural areas. And of course, they've been hit hard by the pandemic. And then third, communities of color in particular as well have been persistently on the wrong side of the digital divide. And have really suffered extremely through the pandemic as well. 1 in 3 Black adults does not have a home broadband connection. More than 1 in 3 Latinx adults don't have a home broadband connection. So there is a confluence of issues here. Agree that knowing where is particularly important, but there have been longstanding magnified and amplified issues of equities, including digital equity, that have turned the digital divide into a monstrous COVID-19 divide here.
I'm wondering, of the people who don't have that access to fixed broadband in their homes, do you have a sense on what percentage of those are because the infrastructure literally doesn't exist in their homes, and how much of it is because of cost?
Yeah, it's a really important question. There really are kind of 3 different ways to come at this. The fact of the matter is that I've called for the FCC to have a connectivity stimulus But like many longstanding issues, this is multivariable calculus here. And so you're not just solving for one thing. There are three kind of main core reasons why we know that American households remain unserved. The first, what you're talking about, is kind of broadband access. We're talking about fundamentally, does the internet and broadband reach that last mile to your household? The good news from the FCC standpoint is that we have dedicated $20 billion over the last year or so. It's going to be a 10-year build out to these rural areas, and is a good measure of ways to say that help is on the way. The second major thing that I would say hurts us is digital literacy. This is particularly true for our seniors. And I've said before, a lot of folks like to say, I've lived 70 great years on this earth, haven't needed the internet yet. But that is obviously changing. And in particular, issues like telehealth and isolation issues amongst seniors, I think, is reframing that for them. And we need to make sure that there's a comfortable, safe way. But really, to your point, where I want to spend, and have spent a lot of my time and a lot of my effort, is talking about the issue of affordability. There are well over 18 million households. That's household where you have multiple folks living in a household who don't have broadband simply because it's too expensive. Millions of, say it again.
Well, let me ask: is broadband too expensive? And obviously, for a certain person, it's too expensive. But just in general, do you feel the broadband companies, are they charging too much?
I think I in particular, there are folks that focus on what is the average cost to make sure that there is an entry point for a lot of people. But I'm really focused, particularly laser focused on these folks that are disconnected. They are the folks that are getting left behind. Millions of families, especially those struggling with unemployment during the pandemic, already are making tough decisions about food on the table and rent. And paying for a home connection really is just a bridge too far. And so I have been pushing to make sure providers are offering that high-speed broadband connection for $10, $11, $12. That's what an affordable option is ultimately going to look like. But I don't think, private programs are a full solution here. There's legislation that we need to enact that is, I'm tight on goals, loose on means, whether it comes as a subsidy or as a voucher. This is an active debate on the Hill. But I think, we're talking about making sure that ISPs have the right business case incentive to pick up these tens of millions of new customer households that aren't currently customers. So I think this is a win-win-win, focusing on the issue of affordability.
There's also this E-rate program, which is currently something that schools use for access, public libraries use for access. Is that something that should be expanded or made more flexible so that households can use it as well?
For sure. I think it is an absolute must-have. And it's something that I am hopeful that we'll be able to move on quickly here. We need to have the FCC's E-rate program step up. And that means extending connectivity, extending equipment and devices under the program to meet students where they are, which is their classrooms right now are predominantly in their home. And while E-rate's an important part, I also want to focus on a program, another FCC program, that is the only federal program specifically designed to connect low-income Americans. Again, a particular focus of mine during this pandemic. The program, frankly, is drastically underutilized. About 7 million folks out of the 38 plus million that are eligible for it actually utilize the program. And so, again, households that are dealing with food insecurity, housing insecurity, are also likely to have digital security issues. And so we need to have a better cross collaboration, work with SNAP at USDA and with HUD and HHS and all of the whole of government to make sure that those struggling Americans right now know how to make sure that they can get connected.
When you talk about the things you think the FCC should do or do a better job of going forward, there's obviously a political context to all this, which is you've been in the minority on the FCC for a while, about to become part of the majority. Not going to ask you who you think the chair is going to be or in that. But beyond that, what do you think this FCC over the next 4 years is going to be able to accomplish that you weren't able to accomplish over the last 4, just because you're going to have a different composition?
Yeah, I think in particular with regard to, there are a lot of issues that the FCC handles that I think will be handled differently. Obviously, issues of net neutrality, issues of security, I think will be focus issues of privacy. But what I really want to focus on the conversation today, and something that drives my thinking every day, really is how do we better help see Americans through the pandemic. And the fact of the matter is that the digital divide is impacting those that are disconnected in so many ways. 4 quickly that I'll highlight for you. The first is our economy. It's being powered by the internet right now. Teleworking, commerce have dramatically shifted online. And so, if you are part of the digital divide, you are also part of an economic opportunity divide. Again, the millions that have lost their jobs at this very moment, we're going to need to make sure that those folks can both apply for unemployment benefits right now, but also are going to have the job training that they're going to need to come around the corner. The second thing I would mention is personal connections. If you are on the wrong side of the digital divide, attending church, visiting with friends, relatives, baby showers, graduations, all the things that we know are requiring access to video conferencing right now. And this also redounds to the mental health aspect of the pandemic that so many folks are talking about and paying attention to. The third thing, really quickly, that I mentioned is health. Access to telemedicine and telehealth via affordable, reliable broadband is going to be extremely important to making sure that folks can safely manage their health from home. And it's especially necessary, again, for our elderly members who may be on a fixed income, but also need to be able to stay safe instead of trying to get through public transportation or further risking themselves going to a physician's office. And the last thing I'd say, something that we talked about briefly, for E-rate, is education. Recent reports are showing that we have nearly 17 million children without broadband access at home. The problem is especially acute in communities of color.
I was just going to ask, when we talk or hear about broadband access, we hear a lot about rural broadband or rural broadband access. From what you're saying, though, particularly with some of the percentages you're talking about, this isn't just a rural issue, correct? This is as much an urban exurbs issue as anything else.
I could not agree more, and would emphasize that, again, when you're talking about just sheer numbers, the fact of the matter is that I'm originally from Kansas. And so I deeply understand the issue of rural access. We hear about students that are getting mailed packets of instructional worksheets to their home and how frustrating that is. But there are 3 times as many disconnected, unconnected, unserved folks that live in urban, densely populated areas. In the city of Detroit, over 60% of the public school students lacked a connection. And so this is deeply impacting our Black students, our Latinx students. They're finding themselves over 10, 11 months behind. This is going to have lasting effects on this next generation of learners, our next generation of leaders. And so, the good news, like I said, is that we have focused on rural broadband in the Trump administration. The Trump administration's FCC has focused on rural broadband. There's still more to be done. Don't get me wrong. I think you're going to need to see additional funding for us to be able to build out everywhere. But we really need to focus on the disconnected right now that live in urban, densely populated areas as well. And that's how you're going to need to really focus on the issues of affordability. Focus on some of those marginalized communities, low-income folks that need to have the connections that we know that they need.
FCC Commissioner Geoffrey Starks, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
And thank all of you for joining us for another virtual conversation that made all of us smarter, faster, and to our sponsor, Comcast, without whom we wouldn't have been able to do any of this. For the latest news, please check out Axios.com or the Axios app. Be sure to sign up for my newsletter, Axios Pro Rata, at signup.axios.com. And what's coming new in 2021 from Axios is Axios Local in cities like Denver and Des Moines, Iowa. Check out axios.com/local to see if we are coming to your city. Again, thank you for joining, and we'll see you at axios.com.